I was wearing the only thing I had left that felt like Sunday best, a beige linen dress that smelled faintly of mothballs, a relic from a life that no longer felt like my own. My son, Robert, was getting married, and a part of me, the part that still remembered the little boy with a gap-toothed smile, wanted to be happy. But as I watched him and his bride, Tiffany, from a table tucked away in the corner of the ballroom, all I felt was the familiar, hollow ache of being unseen. This whole event, from the soaring floral arrangements to the string quartet, felt less like a celebration of love and more like a carefully staged performance of my family's new, glorious life, a life I had no part in. They had told me it was too expensive to fly me in properly, so I'd taken a bus from my small apartment in Ohio all the way to her father's estate in Connecticut, a journey that had left me with a permanent crick in my neck and a sense of profound exhaustion. Tiffany's family, the Carters, were a different breed altogether. They had money, a kind of money that wasn't earned but simply was, like the air they breathed. Tiffany herself was a vision in a silk gown that must have cost more than my entire retirement fund, a fact she'd subtly but deliberately mentioned to me in a conversation I'd rather forget. "Are you even listening, Beatrice?" Tiffany's voice cut through my thoughts, sharp as a stiletto heel. She was standing over me, her perfect smile a little too tight, her eyes, usually a cold blue, now sparkling with a cruel kind of amusement. My heart hammered against my ribs, the way it always did when she was near. It was a strange fear, not of physical harm, but of being publicly dissected, of having my little world of dignity torn to shreds. I had already experienced this once when she had casually mocked my old cardigan, and the memory was a fresh wound. I swallowed, my mouth dry. "I'm sorry, dear. The music is a little loud in my ears. Well, they aren't what they used to be." It was a feeble excuse, and we both knew it. She leaned closer, her expensive perfume overpowering the scent of the food on my plate. "She asked if I've tasted the mashed potatoes," she said, her voice dripping with mock concern. "Daddy's private chef prepared them. They're simply divine, but you've just been pushing them around on your plate." Robert was at the main table, lost in conversation with the group of men in tuxedos. He hadn't looked my way once since the ceremony. I was invisible, a ghost haunting the banquet hall. A few of Tiffany's friends at a nearby table were giggling into their napkins, their eyes fixed on us. I could feel the heat rise in my cheeks. This was a setup, a public humiliation, and I was the star of the show. She wanted me to feel small, worthless, and utterly out of place. "I was about to," I said, my voice barely a whisper. My hand, trembling slightly, reached for my fork. I'm not very hungry. I suppose the trip." "Nonsense." Tiffany's smile vanished. "You're a guest. You must enjoy the food." She grabbed the bowl of steaming mashed potatoes from the center of the table. The motion was so sudden, so theatrical, that the chatter around the room quieted. A silence fell, thick and expectant. I looked up at her, my mouth agape, a strange mixture of shame and disbelief washing over me. A part of me, the logical, adult part, couldn't comprehend what was happening. But another part, the terrified inner child, knew exactly what was coming. "Taste the food, old witch," she said, her voice a low snarl that was only for my ears. And then with a swift, malicious movement, she took the bowl and slammed my face into the hot, buttery potatoes. The heat was a searing shock, the texture slimy and foreign against my skin. The laughter from the nearby table erupted, a wave of cruel, uninhibited sound. A potato slid down my nose, landing on my lip, its warmth a disgusting, humiliating reminder of what she had done. Tears welled in my eyes, not of pain, but of a profound, heart-shattering shame. This wasn't just a prank. It was a statement, a declaration that I was nothing, that I had no place here, that I was a caricature of a sad old woman. The room swimmed around me. I could see Robert's silhouette at the main table, his back still to me. Did he not hear the laughter? Did he not feel the shift in the air? The thought was a more bitter truth than the potatoes on my face. As I stood there, frozen in a silent, mortifying tableau, a hush fell over the room once more. I heard a muffled gasp and then a woman's voice, not from Tiffany's clique, but from the back of the room, screamed with a sound of genuine gut-wrenching terror. "She's a billionaire!" The words hung in the air, a single impossible phrase that shattered the carefully constructed reality of the room. All heads turned to the woman who had screamed. I saw her then, a frail-looking lady, dressed simply, her face pale as a ghost. She was clutching her chest, her eyes wide with shock. A man quickly rushed to her side, whispering something in her ear, and she shook her head as if trying to deny what she had just seen. Tiffany's face, a second ago flushed with victory, went completely white. Her mouth hung open, and the mashed potato bowl slipped from her grasp, clattering to the floor with a hollow thud. The sound was swallowed by a sudden, profound silence. Everyone was looking at me, but their gaze had changed. It wasn't the look of mockery I was used to. It was a look of disbelief, of awe, of a new, unsettling curiosity. My mind reeled. A billionaire? The word was so absurd, so foreign to my reality of meager savings and bus trips, that I almost laughed. But the terror on that woman's face was real. I wiped my face with the napkin, trying to gain a moment of clarity. What did she mean? Who was she? And why did she suddenly have a reason to fear me? This was all a terrible, horrifying joke, wasn't it? But the hushed whispers that began to ripple through the room told me otherwise. Something had shifted, something fundamental. A secret, one I didn't even know I was keeping, had just been revealed.
My son, Robert, finally turned around. His gaze met mine, and for a fleeting moment I saw a flash of concern, of something close to recognition in his eyes. But it was quickly replaced by a confused frown, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle he had no pieces for. He looked at Tiffany, who was now just staring at me, her cheeks flushed with a new kind of shame. "Mother, what on earth?" Robert began, his voice laced with annoyance. He still hadn't processed the words that had been screamed just moments ago. The mashed potatoes, a cold, clumpy mess, were still clinging to the front of my dress. I felt a sudden, fierce pride swell up in my chest, a fire where there had only been a cold ache. I looked at Tiffany, at her carefully coiffed hair and her disdainful mouth. "You've made your point, dear," I said, my voice steady, no longer a whisper. "I'm not hungry." "Someone should call security," Tiffany's father, a man with a bloated face and an even more bloated ego, boomed from the main table. This is an outrage." He was a man who saw the world in dollar signs and social hierarchy, and my presence was an affront to both. But the woman who had screamed, the ghost-faced woman in the simple dress, spoke up again, her voice trembling but clear. "Mr. Carter, please," she said, "you don't understand. That's Beatrice Sterling." Silence again. The name, my name, seemed to echo in the cavernous hall. The Carters, the guests, even Robert, seemed to freeze. It was as if she had uttered an incantation, a magic word that changed everything. "What about her?" Robert asked, his voice now a mix of confusion and irritation. He wasn't connecting the dots, couldn't see the big picture. He was still stuck on the mashed potatoes, the social embarrassment, the public display. He couldn't grasp the concept that there was more at stake than just the dignity of his new bride. Beatrice Sterling, the founder of the Sterling Legacy Fund, the one who disappeared from the public eye over 20 years ago, the one who made her fortune in sustainable energy patents before anyone cared about it, the one everyone thought had passed away and left her fortune to her only son, who was supposed to donate it to a foundation in his name? The information hit me like a physical blow. The words were a jumble in my head. Sterling Legacy Fund.
My husband, John, had always talked about it. He had spent his last years working on it, a foundation meant to preserve the national parks he loves so much. He had told me he was leaving everything to it to ensure our family name would be remembered for something good, something meaningful. But when he died, all I had received was a small annuity and a life insurance policy. All the rest, the patents, the investments, the millions he had made, seemed to have vanished. I had always assumed they had been lost in some failed business venture or that I had simply been too ignorant to understand his complex finances. But now this woman was saying the fund was real, that I was its founder, and that the money was still there. My mind raced, trying to put the pieces together. The name of my husband's foundation, the fact that no one seemed to know about it, the way I had been treated since his death. It was a cruel, sickening puzzle. "This is ridiculous," Tiffany's mother huffed, her eyes wide as she stared at me as if I were a ghost. "Beatrice Sterling is a recluse. She hasn't been seen in public for decades. Her own son doesn't even know her." The words were meant to be an insult, but they struck me as a profound truth. Robert's face was a mask of confusion, his carefully curated image of a successful son now shattered. I looked at the woman who had spoken up. Her name was Eleanor, I remembered from one of John's old journals. She had been his personal assistant, an unassuming woman who had always stood in the background. She had been the one to send me the check for my plane ticket, but I had refused it, not wanting to be a burden. She had sent the bus ticket instead, and I had taken it without a word, too proud to ask for more. Eleanor approached me, her eyes filled with a mix of pity and fear. "Mrs. Sterling," she whispered, her voice a plea, "I'm so sorry. I didn't want to reveal this, but what they did, it was unconscionable. The whole time they thought they were ridiculing a poor old woman, but they were ridiculing the one person who could have helped them the most." The word "they" hung in the air. Not just Tiffany, not just the Carters. They. It was a terrible, horrifying revelation. It meant that someone in my own family had known, that someone had been keeping this secret. I looked at Robert. His face was unreadable. Had he known? Had he allowed me to live in that tiny apartment, to take a bus to his wedding, to be publicly humiliated while all this time he knew? The thought was a sharp needle, a pain more profound than the embarrassment. A familiar shame crept back in. Shame for not knowing, for being so blind, for being so easily fooled by the son I had loved and raised. I took a deep breath, the air in my lungs trembling. I was no longer the invisible old woman in the corner. I was the center of attention, the subject of 1,000 new questions and 1,000 new assumptions. They had seen a victim, a burden, but they had just discovered they were looking at a benefactor, a power they had desperately needed without even knowing it. And in that moment, as I stood there, face smeared with mashed potatoes, I understood what I had to do. The journey ahead would not be about money or revenge. It would be about dignity, about teaching a lesson, and about finding out the truth about my own family. This was the first time in a long time I felt like I wasn't just existing, but living. All I had to do was ask the right questions and the dominoes would begin to fall. But how could I do that without revealing everything I now knew? And then I saw it. A flash of recognition in Tiffany's eyes as she stared at Eleanor. She knew who she was. She knew who I was. And that meant the entire humiliation was not a spur-of-the-moment act of cruelty, but a carefully orchestrated play to show me my place. The thought chilled me to my core. And as I stood there, the weight of the secret pressing on me, I had an idea. It was a risky one, a way to test their intentions and to get to the truth, a way that required me to be even more vulnerable than I already was, but it was the only way. I had to give them a reason to trust me, a reason to bring me into their lives, a reason to reveal their true selves. I had to become the very thing they despised, a frail, helpless old woman, a burden they couldn't ignore. It was a gamble. But I had a feeling the stakes were about to get a lot higher. I said with a weak smile on my face, "I'm not feeling well. All this excitement,
Do you mind if I just sit here and rest for a bit? The words were a lie, a carefully crafted performance, but they had the desired effect. Tiffany's mother and father, their expressions now a mix of confusion and suspicion, rushed to my side. Of course, Mrs. Sterling, Mr. Carter said, his voice now slick with an unsettling deference. Please, let us get you a chair, anything you need. I smiled to myself, a small, private victory. They had no idea I had just set a trap for them. You know, there's a saying my grandmother used to have, when you least expect it, a sparrow can bring you a dragon. I never understood it until today. Whole life, I had tried to be a good wife, a good mother, to fade into the background, but in that moment, I realized that fading away was no longer an option. I had to step into the light. I had to become a dragon. I have a feeling you, my dears, know exactly what that feels like. Please consider subscribing to our channel to hear how my story ends, because trust me, this is only the beginning.
The day after the wedding was a blur of polite fictions and thinly veiled hostility. The Carters, suddenly attentive to a fault, had insisted I stay at their estate. I feigned a frail constitution, a convenient ailment that granted me an audience and kept them on edge. My room was a monument to their newfound uneasy respect, a vast impersonal space filled with heavy mahogany furniture and a faint, cloying scent of potpourri. It was a prison of gilded bars, but it gave me the space I needed to think. The truth was, I felt stronger than I had in years. The shame had burned away, leaving behind a hard, crystalline core of resolve. I had spent so long being a ghost, a quiet shadow in my own family, that I had forgotten the woman I used to be. The one who had stood beside John as he built his dreams, the one who had navigated the small, treacherous world of local politics and school board meetings. I wasn't just a mother, I was Beatrice Sterling, and I was about to find out exactly what that meant. My first visitor was Robert, my son. He came in the morning, a mug of coffee in his hand, his face a jumble of conflicting emotions, concern, confusion, and a deep-seated embarrassment. He sat on the edge of the ornate chair, a respectful distance away, and for a moment I saw the little boy who used to come to me with a skinned knee. "Mother," he began, his voice low and hesitant. I'm so sorry about what happened yesterday. Tiffany, she can be a little impulsive." The apology felt hollow, a flimsy bandage over a gaping wound. "Impulsive," I repeated, my voice as calm as a still lake. "Robert, she purposefully humiliated me in front of all your new friends and family. Your wife called me an old witch and then assaulted me with a bowl of mashed potatoes. That wasn't impulsive. That was a performance. And you stood there and did nothing." My words were not an accusation, but a simple statement of fact, a narrative I had been silently composing all night. He flinched, the coffee cup rattling in its saucer. "I didn't see it that way, Mother. I was preoccupied. And besides, all this talk about you being some kind of billionaire, it's absurd. I would know if you were. I handle your finances." I watched him carefully, his face a mask of practiced confidence, but the confidence was a thin veneer. I could see the cracks in his eyes, the subtle darting of his gaze. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking at an imaginary spreadsheet, a number that didn't add up. "Do you, Robert?" I asked. "Do you really?" I didn't have the answers, but I had the questions, and my questions were a powerful weapon. "Of course I do," he said, his voice rising in irritation. "You have a small pension from my father and a small trust. It's enough to live comfortably, but it's not this." He gestured vaguely to the opulent room. "Where did that woman get such an absurd idea?" This was the moment. The hero's journey, they say, is a road of trials. This was my first. I had to choose my words carefully. I had to give him just enough to make him think, just enough to make him wonder,
but not enough to give away my hand. I decided to use one of the Cialdini's principles, the principle of authority. I would reference John, my late husband, a man whose wisdom Robert had always revered. "Your father," I said, and watched as the name resonated with him, a deep-seated chord of respect. He always said that true wealth wasn't in the bank, but in the patents. He had a way of seeing the future, you know? He called it building a legacy of kindness, of vision. I paused, letting the words sink in. He told me that one day the truth would reveal itself and that I should be ready. He always said, "Let them think what they want, Beatrice. The truth is its own reward." I was paraphrasing from a memory, from a conversation we had on a long-ago night, sitting on our porch swing. It was a memory that had been buried under years of neglect and shame. Robert's expression shifted. The defensiveness began to crumble, replaced with a flicker of doubt, a spark of curiosity. "Patents? What patents?" he asked, his voice now a low whisper. "I don't know, son. I'm an old woman. Your father handled all the big decisions. All I know is that he told me to hold on to something important. He said it was in a box, hidden away from the world, a box that could change everything." My internal monologue was screaming. A box? I had no idea if there was a box. It was a narrative I was creating on the spot, a story to give them a reason to search, a reason to come to me, a reason to reveal what they knew. It was a narrative to get them to believe, to use their own greed as a tool for my discovery. I was using the narrative therapy principle, reframing my own story, and in doing so, I was forcing them to reframe theirs. "A box?" Robert said, his eyes now wide with a new kind of light. A light I recognized, a light I had seen in his father's eyes when he was about to close a big deal. Greed. It was an ugly thing to see in your own child's face, but in this case, it was a necessary tool. He quickly rose from his seat. "Where is it? Do you know?" I shook my head slowly, a sad, helpless mother. I can't remember, Robert. My mind, you see, it's getting foggy, old age." It was a feigned memory loss, a subtle manipulation, but it felt like a crucial step in the strange dance. I could see the inner dialogue playing out on his face, the conflict between his skepticism and his desperate need to believe. "I have to go," he said, the old irritation returning. He wasn't a hero in this story. He was a man caught between two worlds, and his old world of financial struggle was winning the battle. "I have things to do. I'll be back later. Maybe you can try to remember?" He left as quickly as he'd come, leaving behind the empty coffee cup and a palpable sense of unease. I watched him go, a sense of profound sadness settling over me. The hero's journey is often about finding strength, but it's also about losing illusions. I had just lost a big one. I had always believed that my son, even with all his flaws, was a good man. But I had just seen that he was willing to trade his own mother's dignity for a chance at a fortune. The pain was sharp, but the knowledge was a grim comfort. My son had left, but I knew he would be back. He would consult with Tiffany, with the Carters. They would dissect my every word, my every gesture. They would try to find the hidden key to this mystery, and I would be ready for them. The game was on. I walked over to the window, the sun streaming in, and looked out at the manicured lawn. I was no longer an old woman in a borrowed room. I was a puppet master, and the strings were in my hands. What a strange and terrifying feeling. But as I looked out, I saw a woman hurrying away from the main house. It was Eleanor, John's old assistant. She was carrying a small, worn leather bag. My heart leaped into my throat. Where was she going? And why did her hurried departure feel so ominous? Had I said something wrong? Had I scared her off? The sight of her, A fleeting shadow disappearing into the trees left me with a new, unsettling question. Was I the only one who didn't know the truth about my husband's legacy? Or was there another player in this game, a person I had always overlooked, a person who had been there all along, quietly holding the most important piece of all? What if John's legacy wasn't just a foundation, but a test? A test to see who deserved it? And then I felt a new fear. What if I had just started a fire I couldn't control?
The rest of the day was a study in theatricality. Mr. and Mrs. Carter paid me a visit, their voices syrupy with false concern, their eyes greedily scanning the room as if searching for a hidden stash of gold. They offered me food, drinks, and assurances of my welcome. It was all a performance, a clumsy one at that, meant to make me believe they were my allies. But I could see their real motive in the way they kept glancing at each other, the small conspiratorial nods they exchanged. They wanted me to open up. They wanted me to give them a clue, a hint, a morsel of information about the box. I played along, of course. I talked about John, about our love, about our memories. I talked about the little things, the way he smelled of sawdust and old books, the way he would hum when he was working on a new idea, the way he would bring me a single white rose from the garden every anniversary. These weren't lies, they were truth, carefully placed and woven into a new tapestry. I was giving them the illusion of intimacy while keeping the real secret, the secret of my feigned memory loss, close to my chest. They were so focused on the prospect of money that they couldn't see the real game, the emotional one. The evening brought another surprise. Tiffany came to see me, alone. She was no longer the cruel girl from the day before. Her face was pale, her hands wringing a delicate silk scarf. She looked scared. It was a new look for her, and it made my stomach churn with a complex mix of triumph and unease. "Beatrice," she said, her voice small. She hadn't used my first name before. I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me yesterday. It was the stress of the wedding. It was childish. I was a child. Can you ever forgive me?" Her words were a desperate plea, but I could hear the calculation behind them. She wasn't seeking forgiveness. She was seeking information. She was a master manipulator, and for a moment I almost fell for it. But then I remembered the mashed potatoes, the laughter, the profound sense of shame. That wasn't a moment of childish stress. That was a moment of pure malice. "Forgiveness is a complicated thing, dear," I said, looking her straight in the eye. I used a technique from transactional analysis, speaking to her from my adult ego state, calmly, without emotion. It's not just a word, it's a process, and it requires more than an apology. It requires understanding. Understanding why you would want to humiliate a person in front of their own family. Why you would want to make me feel so small. She looked away, her face flushing. I just thought you were trying to ruin Robert's day. Coming here, looking so old and out of place. We worked so hard on this wedding. I just wanted it to be perfect." "And a perfect wedding in your mind required you to assault your new mother-in-law?" I asked, my voice still calm. She bit her lip, her eyes filling with a new kind of fear. She couldn't lie to my face anymore. She had been caught in her own trap. The air between us was thick with unspoken truths. I knew she had known about me, and I knew that she had orchestrated this entire event to make me feel worthless. But I still didn't know the full extent of the betrayal. Who else was involved?
Was it just Tiffany and the Carters, or had Robert been a willing participant in this little play? I had to find out. I had to push her just a little bit more. "Tell me, Tiffany," I said, my voice softening just enough for her to lean in. "When you saw Eleanor yesterday, the woman who screamed, what did you know? Why did you look so frightened?" The question was a bombshell. She gasped, a small, frightened sound. Her eyes darted to the door, as if looking for an escape. I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice was shaky and her hand was trembling violently. This was my first twist. Tiffany didn't know that Eleanor was the source of my knowledge. She thought that the secret had just been screamed into the room. She was more afraid of Eleanor than she was of me. Why? What did Eleanor represent to her? I had a sudden, cold realization. Tiffany had probably been in contact with Eleanor before. She hadn't just stumbled upon the information. She had gone looking for it. And what had she found? Eleanor was John's assistant, I said a little too quickly. A very loyal one. She was the only person he trusted with the foundation. I suppose she saw me and thought it was a terrible injustice. "The foundation?" she asked, her voice a little too eager. "What foundation?" I sighed, a tired, weary sound. "The Sterling Legacy Fund. It was my husband's dream, to help people, to make a difference." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a new, predatory light. "And where is the money for this fund?" "I don't know," I lied again, my voice trembling. "I told Robert. It's in a box, somewhere, but I can't remember where. I feel so tired. My mind is playing tricks on me." I let my eyes well up with a few tears, a little acting job I was surprisingly good at. She reached out and patted my hand, a cold, calculated gesture of false empathy. "Don't you worry, Beatrice," she said, her voice now a conspiratorial whisper. "Robert and I will help you remember. We'll find it. We'll make sure the Sterling legacy is, well, taken care of. You just rest. Leave everything to us." And then she left, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I knew what she was going to do. She was going to go to Robert. They were going to start a search. They were going to ransack the house, my old things, anything they could get their hands on, looking for a box that didn't exist. They were going to play right into my hands. But as I sat there, a new question began to gnaw at me. Eleanor, why had she screamed? And what was she doing here? What was in that little leather bag she was carrying? I had a terrible feeling that the secret was not just about the money, but about something far more dangerous, something that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. The game was on. The hunt for the box had begun. But the real treasure wasn't in a box. It was in the truth. And I had a feeling that the truth was going to hurt. My mind kept coming back to that moment, to Eleanor's terrified scream. It wasn't just a revelation. It was a warning. And I had a feeling I wasn't the one she was trying to warn. I had a feeling that her fear was for me. But why? I felt a strange sense of excitement, a thrill I hadn't felt in decades. The old woman who had been so easily humiliated was gone. In her place was a woman with a purpose, a woman with a plan, a woman with a secret. But what I didn't know yet was that there was a second secret, one that went even deeper, a secret that would be revealed by the one person I least expected. And that was when my world would truly turn upside down. What if the story of the Sterling legacy was not what I thought it was? What if the real legacy was not of money, but of something much more painful, something that I had forgotten?
The next few days were an absurd dance of power and pretense. The Carters and my son, Robert, took turns visiting me, their conversations a clumsy interrogation masked as loving concern. They were trying to get me to remember where the mythical box was. I played my role perfectly, a frail, confused old woman whose mind wandered from one topic to the next, never quite landing on the one they so desperately wanted to hear. I talked about John, about our life, about the old cottage in Maine, about the smell of salt and pine, about the way the waves crashed against the shore at night. It was all true, but it was all a deflection. My favorite was when Tiffany brought me a small, ornate jewelry box. "Look what I found in the study, Beatrice," she said, her voice filled with feigned excitement. "It's so beautiful. Did John give it to you? Do you remember anything about it?" Her eyes were like a hawk's, watching my every move. The box was empty, of course. She was testing me, hoping I would react, hoping I would recognize it. I smiled a sad, nostalgic smile. "It's beautiful, dear," I said, and placed it on my nightstand. "But no, I'm afraid I don't remember it." My memory was a battlefield, and I was winning the war. They were so focused on the material that they couldn't see the emotional landscape. This was my secret strength, the ability to act as if I had no power at all. They were so used to seeing me as a helpless old woman that they couldn't conceive of me as the person I truly was, an intelligent, observant human being with a plan. It was a perfect execution of the hero's journey principle, where the hero's transformation begins with an internal shift, an acceptance of a new, unexpected reality. I was no longer the victim. I was the architect of my own destiny. I was also using the principles from Carl Rogers on becoming a person. I was starting to accept myself, my past, and my purpose. But even a master puppeteer can lose a string. The tension was building, and I could feel it in the air, a physical weight. Robert and Tiffany were becoming more and more impatient. The fake smiles were wearing thin. I knew they would soon become desperate, and desperation, I knew, was a dangerous thing. The climax of this strange play came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting in the sunroom, a cup of lukewarm chamomile tea in my hand, when Robert and Tiffany burst in. They were no longer pretending to be kind. Their faces were flushed, their eyes hard and angry. "Mother," Robert began, his voice a low growl, "we've looked everywhere. We've been through every box, every file. There's no secret stash, no box, nothing. This is all a lie, isn't it?" I looked at him, my heart aching with a familiar sorrow. He was no longer the boy I had raised. He was a man consumed by greed, a man who had lost his way. The parent-adult-child dynamic from transactional analysis was playing out right in front of me. I was the parent, the one with the moral authority. He was the child, angry and demanding, stumping his feet because he didn't get what he wanted. "A lie, Robert?" I asked, my voice still as calm as the tea in my cup. "Why would I lie? What would I have to gain?" "Everything!" Tiffany screamed, her self-control finally breaking. "Dignity, respect, a place in our family. You wanted to humiliate us the way we humiliated you." I looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. I saw not a monster, but a scared, insecure young woman who had been raised to believe that a person's worth was measured in money and social standing. She was a product of her environment, a tragic victim of her own misguided values. This was the moment I chose to use the narrative therapy principle, to reframe her story, to force her to see the truth. "Tiffany," I said, my voice soft, "I didn't want to humiliate you. I wanted you to see me as a person, not as a burden, not as a relic,
just as a human being." The words hung in the air. For a fleeting moment, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a spark of understanding, of recognition. But it was quickly extinguished by her husband's anger. "Stop playing games, Mother," Robert shouted, his face contorted in a mask of rage. "We know you have something. That woman, Eleanor, said you were a billionaire. We need that money. The Carters have financial problems. We need to save the business. We're losing everything. We thought you would give it to us, but you're just a mean old woman playing a cruel joke." His words hit me like a physical blow. The Carters' financial problems. That was the missing piece of the puzzle. That's why they had been so desperate, so eager to believe in a mythical inheritance. It wasn't just about greed. It was about survival. A small part of me, the part that had always loved my son, felt a surge of pity. But the other part, the part that was a woman with a purpose, knew that pity was a luxury I couldn't afford. "I see," I said, my voice still low and steady. "So this was all a test to see if I was worthy of your love and respect. A test I failed miserably, it seems." The silence was deafening. He had no answer. He was so consumed by his own needs that he couldn't see the depth of his betrayal. And then I made a choice. I would not reveal the truth. Not yet. I would give them a little more rope. I would let them get to the end of their search, to the point of no return. I would let them realize their mistake on their own. That was the most important lesson I could teach them. I looked at Robert, and I saw a scared little boy who was lost. I saw the fear in his eyes, the terror of losing everything he had worked for. But I also saw the greed, the cold calculation that had replaced the warmth of a son's love. And then I realized something that chilled me to the bone. My son hadn't just been a passive observer. He had been an active participant. He had known about the Carters' financial problems all along. He had known that this was a test, and he had willingly chosen to humiliate me, his own mother, for the sake of his wife's family. The thought was a more bitter pill than any mashed potato. But my shock was about to turn into a different kind of pain.
The silence in the sunroom was broken by the sound of a key turning in the lock. I looked up, and a tall, gaunt man walked in. He was wearing a simple dark suit, and he was carrying a worn leather satchel. It was Eleanor's husband, Frank. I remembered him from John's funeral, a quiet, reserved man who always stood in the background. Robert and Tiffany stared at him, their faces a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "What are you doing here, Frank?" Robert asked, his voice full of venom. "This is a private conversation." Frank didn't answer. He walked past them, his eyes fixed on me. He stopped in front of me, and without a word, he opened his satchel and took out a small, tattered notebook. He placed it on the table between us. It was John's handwriting on the cover, a familiar scrawl that sent a jolt of recognition through me. "He told me to give this to you, Mrs. Sterling, only when you needed it the most. He told me to wait until you were truly alone, truly without hope. He said you would know when the time was right." I looked at the notebook, my hand trembling as I reached for it. The moment I touched it, it was as if 1,000 memories rushed back into my mind. The smell of his cologne, the sound of his laugh, the feel of his hand in mine. It was a tangible piece of the man I had loved and lost, a bridge to a past I had thought was gone forever. Robert and Tiffany lunged for the notebook, their eyes wide with greed, but Frank was faster. He snatched it off the table and held it out of their reach. "This is for her," he said, his voice firm. "Not for you, not for anyone. It's for her alone."
Robert and Tiffany backed away, their faces a mask of frustration and rage. They were so close, and yet so far. The power had shifted again. It was now in my hands. The notebook was a physical manifestation of that power, a symbol of the knowledge they so desperately craved. I opened the notebook and began to read. It was a journal, a chronicle of John's last years. He wrote about his love for me, about his hopes for our son, about his dreams for the foundation. And then I turned to a page with a different kind of entry, a page with a different kind of handwriting. It was my own handwriting. My hands began to shake violently. The words on the page were a confession, a terrible, heartbreaking confession from years ago, a confession I had buried so deeply in my mind that I had forgotten it existed. A confession about a foolish, youthful mistake I had made long before I met John, a mistake that had come back to haunt me years later after we were married and had our son. The pages told a story of a business deal gone wrong, a small indiscretion that had spiraled into a debt I couldn't pay. It was a moment of weakness, a moment of fear that had led me to forge a document. It was a terrible, shameful secret that I had confessed to John on a cold winter night, believing he would judge me, and instead he had forgiven me and promised to keep my secret safe. I had forgotten about it. The memory had been so painful, so shameful, that my mind had buried it. But John had not. He had kept it, not as a weapon, but as a reminder of my humanity, of my fallibility. And then I saw the twist. This was the second twist. I was not the only one with a secret. Robert had discovered my secret, and he had used it against me. The Carters' financial problems weren't the only reason for their desperation. It was a false narrative, a false path. The real reason was that Robert had leveraged the knowledge of my youthful indiscretion to gain control of my financial affairs. He had told the Carters that if I was not handled properly, if I was not kept in my place, he would expose my past, bringing shame and ruin to their family. They hadn't been mocking me just for fun. They had been acting on his instructions and his alone. He had even used my name, Sterling, to get the Carters to give him money, to invest in a business that was failing. I looked up from the notebook, my eyes filled with a new kind of tears, not of shame, but of a profound, soul-shattering sadness. I had always believed that Robert had been a good boy, a good son, but I was seeing now that he had been a master manipulator, a person who had used my past, a past I had buried and forgotten, as a weapon against me. He was the hero antagonist, the one person I had trusted the most, who had been working against me all along. The man I thought was my hero was the one who had brought about the crisis in our family. I looked at Robert and I saw a stranger. The face of the little boy with the gap-toothed smile was gone, replaced by a mask of greed and betrayal. He had stolen my past, my dignity, and my future, all to fund a failing business. He had even manipulated Tiffany and the Carters into doing his dirty work for him himself. "You knew," I whispered, the words a bitter taste on my tongue. "You knew all along." He didn't answer. He just stood there, his face pale, his eyes wide with the new kind of fear, the fear of being found out. This was the truth. The Sterling legacy wasn't just about money. It was about me. It was about my past, about the one mistake I had made, and the one person who had used it against me. It was a moral dilemma, a conflict between a mother's love and a son's betrayal. I closed the notebook, the weight of the secret now a tangible presence in my hands. The truth was not just a revelation. It was a devastating burden. And in that moment, I knew that the journey ahead was no longer about teaching a lesson. It was about finding a way to forgive the unforgivable and to reclaim my life, not just for myself, but for the legacy of kindness that my husband had always intended for me. The hero's journey isn't just about the external battles, but about the internal ones. And my most difficult battle was just beginning. Now I knew the whole truth, and it was a terrible, beautiful, and heartbreaking thing. But what was I to do with it? That night, I did something that changed everything, and it wasn't what anyone expected.
The day after the revelation felt strangely quiet. Robert and Tiffany left me alone, their previous hunger for information replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. I knew they were in the main house, huddled together, trying to process the enormity of what they had just learned. The notebook, John's final gift, lay on the table beside my bed, its presence a constant reminder of my past and my son's betrayal. I spent the day rereading my old confession, the words a mirror reflecting a younger, more frightened version of myself. It was an exercise in narrative therapy, a way to re-examine my own story, not as a victim of a terrible secret, but as a person who had made a mistake and had been loved and forgiven despite it. My mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The shame I had felt for decades had been replaced by a fierce protectiveness, not for my money, but for my husband's legacy. He had worked so hard to build something good, something meaningful, and my son was ready to tear it all down for a quick fix to his financial problems. I saw the moral dilemma clearly. Should I expose him and risk ruining his life and reputation, or should I protect him and allow him to continue down this path of greed and deceit? As I sat there, lost in thought, the door opened and Eleanor walked in. She was carrying a small silver tray with a cup of tea and a plate of shortbread cookies. Her movements were quiet, unassuming, just as they had always been. She was a shadow character, a person who had always been in the background but was now playing a pivotal role. "I thought you might want some tea, Mrs. Sterling," she said, her voice soft and kind. "I remember you always used to have tea in the afternoon." It was a simple, everyday detail, the kind of micro-observation that felt like a lifeline in this sea of chaos. I looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. She wasn't just John's assistant. She was a kind, compassionate woman who had been a silent witness to my family's unraveling. "Eleanor," I said, my voice thick with emotion, you knew. All this time, you knew everything." She nodded, her eyes filled with a gentle sadness. "Mr. Sterling made me promise. He said you would need me one day. He said you would need a friend who knew the whole story." Her words were a balm to my soul, a comfort I hadn't realized I was so desperately in need of. She was a testament to the power of human decency and loyalty, a beacon of light in the darkness. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Why did he do this? Why did he keep my secret? And why did he give you that notebook?" She sat down on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap. "He said you had a good heart, Mrs. Sterling. He said you were a fighter, but he also said you were too kind for your own good. He saw what was happening, the way your own son was beginning to take advantage of you. He wanted to give you the tools to fight back, but on your own terms, not with anger, but with dignity. He wanted you to reclaim your life, to remember who you were." Her words were a revelation. I had always thought of John as a simple, good man, but he was more than that. He was a master strategist, a man who had seen the future and had prepared me for it. He knew that a crisis was coming, and he had armed me with the only weapon that mattered, the truth about my own strength and the truth about my son's weakness. "And the foundation?" I asked, the words a raw ache in my throat. "Is it real?" She smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Oh, it's real, Mrs. Sterling, more real than you can possibly imagine, but it's not what you think it is." Her words were a new hook, a new mystery to solve. I had thought I knew everything, but I was wrong.
The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. The true legacy was not of money. It was of something else entirely, something that would require a new kind of strength, a strength I wasn't sure I had. I was no longer in the dark. I knew the truth, but now I had a new dilemma. What was the real legacy, and how would I use it to teach my family a lesson without destroying them in the process? This was the hero's path, a journey of self-discovery, of finding my own moral compass.
Eleanor left, leaving me with my thoughts and a new sense of purpose. I spent the rest of the afternoon and evening immersed in John's journal. It wasn't just a record of his life, it was a conversation, a final message to me. He wrote about his dreams, his fears, and his hopes for me. He had even included a letter to our son, a letter he never intended for him to read unless it became necessary. He had entrusted Eleanor with a key to a safe deposit box at a local bank. He had also left a key to an old cabin in the woods, a place where he had always gone to think and to be alone. I knew now what I had to do. I had to go to the bank and then to the cabin. But first, I had to face my son. I had to see if there was any hope for him, any flicker of the boy I had raised. I had to see if there was a way to save him from himself without sacrificing my own dignity. I was a mother in the transactional analysis sense with a strong moral code, but I was also a human being who had been hurt deeply. The conflict between love and justice was a heavy burden to bear. I went to the main house and found Robert and Tiffany in the living room. They were drinking wine, their faces a pale, anxious mess. The air was thick with the scent of unspoken fear. "Mother," Robert said, his voice an octave too high. "We were just discussing some things." He gestured to the empty space on the couch beside him. "Please sit." I ignored his invitation. I stood in the middle of the room, my gaze fixed on him. "Robert," I said, my voice steady, "I know about the Carters' financial problems, and I know about the failing business you invested in." The words were a direct hit, a verbal uppercut. I watched as his face crumpled in defeat. He looked at Tiffany, then back at me, his eyes filled with a new kind of fear. I was going to tell you," he stammered. I didn't know how. I wanted to surprise you, to be a hero, to save everyone." "By exposing your mother's secret?" I asked, my voice rising a little. "By humiliating me in front of everyone? Is that what a hero does, Robert? Does a hero tear down his own family for the sake of a failing business?" He had no answer. He just stood there, a defeated man, a child who had been caught with his hand in the cookie jar. He was the antagonist in this story, but he was also the victim of his own choices. He was a perfect example of a person who has lost their moral compass. I looked at Tiffany. She was staring at her hands, her face a mask of shame. She was just a pawn in this game, a player who had been manipulated by a man she thought she loved. My heart softened a little. I knew what it felt like to be used, to be an instrument in someone else's play. I took a deep breath. This was my moment. The hero's final test. I had to choose between vengeance and mercy. Vengeance would feel good, a satisfying release of anger and pain. But mercy, I knew, was the harder path. It required more strength. I said, "I'm not going to tell anyone about this. Not about your debt, not about your betrayal, not about my secret." They looked at me, their eyes wide with disbelief. I had just given them a second chance, a fresh start. "But there's a condition," I said, and watched as the relief on their faces turned into a new kind of fear. "You will no longer manage my finances. You will not have access to any of my money, and you will not ask me for a single penny.
You will both go out into the world and find your own way. You will learn the value of hard work and the value of $1. You will learn to be your own heroes." The words were a shock to them. They had expected me to write them a check. They had expected me to save them. But I had just told them to save themselves. The look on their faces was a mix of anger, resentment, and a begrudging respect. I had not saved them, but I had given them the tools to save themselves. And that, I knew, was a more valuable gift than any money I could have given them. But as I left the room, a new thought entered my mind. Was this the right choice? Was this truly the best thing for them? Or had I just condemned them to a life of struggle? The hero's journey is not a straight path, and I knew that my journey was far from over. I still had one last thing to do, one last secret to uncover. The secret of the real legacy. The secret that would change everything, not just for them, but for me. And what would that be? What could be more valuable than $1 billion? The answer, I knew, was waiting for me at the bank and at the old cabin, and I was ready to find it.
The day after my quiet rebellion, I took a taxi to the bank. The air was crisp and cool, a welcome change from the stifling atmosphere of the Carter estate. I felt a sense of purpose, a quiet strength I hadn't felt in years. I was no longer an old woman on a bus, but a person with a destination and a mission. I was going to retrieve what was rightfully mine, but I was going to use it for a purpose far grander than anyone could have imagined. This was the final stage of my hero's journey, the return to the ordinary world, but with a new understanding and a new power. I was no longer a victim. I was a benefactor. At the bank, I met with the manager, a kind-looking man named Mr. Henderson. I presented him with the keys John had left for me, the key to the safe deposit box. He led me down to the vault, a place filled with the hushed reverence of untold secrets. He opened a small metal box, and I looked inside. There was no money, no stocks, no bonds. There was only a single small antique music box and a handwritten letter from John. My heart sank, a familiar disappointment. Had it all been a lie? A cruel final joke? I picked up the letter, my hands trembling. John's familiar scrawl filled the page, a final testament to his love and his wisdom. He wrote that the money was never in the safe deposit box. It was a decoy, a way to test my son's intentions. He wrote that the true legacy was not of money, but of love. He had used the last years of his life not to amass a fortune, but to create something beautiful, something that would benefit others. He had secretly established a trust, the Sterling Legacy Trust, but its purpose was not what anyone had assumed. He had used all of his patents and investments, all the money they had generated, to build a network of community centers across the country, centers for the elderly. They were places where people could go to find companionship, to learn new skills, to feel needed, to find a sense of dignity in their golden years. A place where they would not be dismissed, where they would not be invisible. The letter explained that he had known about my fear of being a burden, about my shame. He had known that my greatest fear was to be forgotten. And so, he had created a legacy that would ensure that no one else would ever have to feel that way. He had left me in charge of the trust, the sole administrator, the person who would decide where the money would go. The letter ended with a simple phrase: "My dearest Beatrice, this is your second chance. Use it to find your own legacy, a legacy of kindness." I sat in the vault, the weight of the music box in my hands, tears streaming down my face. My husband had not just left me a fortune, he had given me a purpose. He had given me a way to use my pain, my shame, my humiliation to help others. He had given me a chance to turn my tragedy into a triumph. This was the final twist, The hero's reward was not a personal gain, but a chance to help others. The money was never the point. The point was the purpose. I left the bank a different woman. The music box was in my hands, a tangible symbol of my new life. It was a moment of profound clarity, a sense of narrative completion. My past had not been a tragedy, but a preparation. My husband had not just loved me, he had empowered me. And now I was ready to use that power, not for vengeance, but for a greater good. I knew what I had to do. I had to go to the old cabin. What was in the music box, and what did it mean for my future? I had a feeling that the answer was not just about my past, but about my future, a future I was finally ready to embrace.
The old cabin in the woods was just as I remembered it, a small, rustic haven of peace and tranquility. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, a scent that instantly transported me back in time. I opened the door, and the first thing I saw was a small, worn photograph on the mantel. It was a picture of me and John, young and full of dreams, standing in front of the cabin. My heart ached with a bitter-sweet nostalgia. I walked to the old rocking chair and sat down, holding the music box in my hands. I wound the key, and the box began to play a soft, familiar melody, the song we had danced to on our wedding day. It was the same song that had been played at my son's wedding, a song that had been ruined by a terrible act of cruelty. But now, as I listened to it in the quiet solitude of the cabin, the song had a new meaning. It was a song of hope, a song of second chances, a song of love. And then I made my final decision. I had a choice. I could use my new power to destroy my son, to expose his lies and his greed, or I could use it to teach him a lesson that would stay with him forever. I chose the latter. I was a mother, and a mother's love I knew was stronger than any amount of money. I went back to the estate, the music box in my hands. I found Robert and Tiffany in the living room, their faces pale and drawn. They were still waiting for my verdict, for the punishment they knew they deserved. I walked to the center of the room and placed the music box on the coffee table. "This," I said, my voice strong and clear, "is the sterling legacy." They looked at the box, their eyes wide with confusion. They had expected money, power, and glory. They had expected to be saved. But all they saw was a small, insignificant box. "There is no money in this box," I said, and watched as their faces fell. "The money is gone. It's been used to build something beautiful, something meaningful. It's been used to build a network of community centers for the elderly, a place where people like me can go and feel safe and loved." They stared at me, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. The revelation was a final, stunning blow. They had been so focused on the material that they had completely missed the moral of the story. They had tried to destroy my dignity, but I had used their act of cruelty to build something beautiful. I looked at Robert, my eyes filled with a new kind of love, a love that was not blind, but clear-sighted. "Robert," I said, "I am not going to punish you. I am not going to expose your lies. I am not going to shame you. I am going to give you a chance to be a better man, a chance to be the hero I always knew you could be." And then I made my final plan. I told them that the Sterling Legacy Trust
would not only be a place for the elderly, but a place where young people could come and learn the value of community, the value of kindness, and the value of hard work. I told them that I would be the sole administrator of the trust, but I would need help. I would need someone to manage the finances, to run the day-to-day operations. I looked at Robert, and I offered him the job. The job came with no salary, no prestige, and no power. It was a job that would require him to work for free, to prove his worth, to earn his redemption. He looked at me, his eyes filled with tears, a mix of shame, regret, and a newfound respect. He had lost everything he had worked for, but he had just been given a chance to get back the one thing he had lost that truly mattered: his mother's respect. He looked at Tiffany, and she nodded, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. They had been given a second chance, a chance to rebuild their lives on a foundation of integrity and kindness, not of greed. I walked out of the room, leaving them with their thoughts, with their newfound mission. The story was over, but the journey had just begun. I was no longer an invisible old woman. I was a person with a purpose, a person who had found her own dignity, her own legacy, a legacy of kindness. I had come to the wedding a victim, but I left a hero. And that I knew was a more valuable triumph than any amount of money in the world. My final act was not of revenge, but of forgiveness. It was not of anger, but of love. It was a lesson in humanity, a lesson in humility, a lesson that would resonate with my family and with anyone who heard my story. The hero's journey is not always about winning a battle, but about finding a way to heal the wounds. And I had found a way to heal not just my own wounds, but the wounds of my family. I had left them with a legacy that was worth more than $1 billion.